Thanksgiving was always a big deal for my family. Every year, my parents hosted a huge dinner at our house, inviting relatives, neighbors, and even a few family friends. The house would be full of laughter, clinking glasses, and the rich aroma of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie. Last year, though, something changed, something I'll never forget. It started like every other Thanksgiving. Mom was in the kitchen by sunrise, wrestling with the turkey, while Dad set up extra chairs in the dining room. By mid-afternoon, guests began to trickle in, their arms full of casseroles, desserts, and bottles of wine. I helped greet everyone at the door, taking their coats and showing them inside. That's when I noticed her, a woman I didn't recognize. She stood at the edge of the yard, just beyond the driveway. She wasn't dressed like the others. While everyone else was bundled up in coats and scarves, she wore a thin, old-fashioned dress, her hair pinned back in a neat bun. She stared at the house, unmoving, her pale hands clutching a small basket. Who's that?" I asked my mom, nodding toward the window. Mom glanced over and frowned. "Probably a neighbor. Go invite her in. It's too cold for her to be standing out there." I hesitated but eventually made my way outside. The air was sharp and cold and the woman didn't move as I approached. Up close, she looked even stranger. Her skin was so pale it was almost gray, and her eyes seemed too big for her face. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile. "Are you here for dinner?" She tilted her head slightly, studying me. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no sound came out. She handed me the basket instead. Inside were old shriveled apples and a few wilted flowers. The scent of decay wafted up from it. Thanks," I said, unsure what else to do. "Why don't you come inside? It's warmer." She didn't answer, just stared at me with those unsettling eyes. After an awkward pause, I turned and walked back to the house, clutching the basket. When I glanced back, she was gone. Inside, the party was in full swing. People were chatting, laughing, and piling their plates high with food. I set the basket on the counter, trying to shake off the strange encounter. When I told my mom about the woman, she just shrugged. Probably one of those weird neighbors from down the street. Don't worry about it. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. As the evening went on, strange things started happening. First, the power flickered. The lights dimmed and buzzed before coming back on, leaving everyone glancing around nervously. Then, the air grew colder, so cold that we could see our breath, even inside the house. My dad joked that the heating system must be on the fritz, but I could tell he was uneasy. And then, people started noticing the smell. It was faint at first, like something damp and earthy, but it grew stronger, filling the house with the stench of rotting leaves and mold. Guests began wrinkling their noses, murmuring to each other. "What is that?" someone asked, covering their mouth. "I don't know," my mom said, looking embarrassed. She checked the trash, the fridge, even the basement, but couldn't find the source. That's when we heard it, a faint knock at the back door. Everyone froze. The knock came again, louder this time. Dad walked over, muttering something about raccoons. He opened the door. No one was there. But the basket was. The one the woman had given me. Only now it was empty. Dad brought it inside, frowning. "Did you move this?" "No," I said, my voice shaking. "Maybe someone's playing a prank," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. Suddenly, all the lights, the house plunged into darkness. People gasped, and someone dropped a glass, the sound shattering in the silence. My mom scrambled for a flashlight while Dad fiddled with his phone. Then we heard it, footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from upstairs. "Is someone up there?" Mom whispered. "No one's supposed to be," Dad said, his voice tight. The footsteps grew louder, descending the stairs, one by one. Everyone turned toward the staircase, holding their breath. A figure emerged from the shadows at the bottom of the steps. It was the woman, the one I'd seen outside. Only now, she looked different. Her dress was soaked, clinging to her thin frame, and her skin was mottled and gray, like she'd been underwater for a long time. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, a low, guttural sound came out. The room erupted into chaos. People screamed, shoving past each other as they tried to get out. I froze, unable to move, as her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "You invited me," she rasped. Her voice was wet and bubbling, like water was trapped in her throat. I didn't," I stammered, but the words caught in my throat. She stepped closer, her feet leaving damp, muddy prints on the floor. Her hand reached out, fingers twisted and skeletal. Just as she was about to touch me, my dad grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the door. We fled the house along with the rest of the guests. From the driveway, I looked back. The woman stood in the doorway watching us, her head tilted again, and for a moment I thought she smiled. We didn't go back until the next day, when the sun was high in the sky. The house was empty, but it was a mess. Muddy footprints tracked across the floors, the dining table overturned, and that basket sitting in the middle of the room. This time, it was filled again, with bones. We sold the house not long after. My parents said it was because of the bad memories, but I know the truth. We weren't the only ones in that house. And whoever, or whatever, she was, she's still there, waiting for someone to invite her in. Months passed, but I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The sight of her, drenched, decaying, and unnatural, haunted my dreams. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was over, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't finished with us. After we sold the house, my family moved to a small apartment in the city. It was cramped compared to our old place, but I welcomed the noise and the crowds. For a while, things seemed normal. The nightmares came less frequently, and I stopped looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. But then, strange things started happening again. It began with the smell. That same damp, earthy stench, faint at first, creeping into the corners of the apartment. My mom thought it was a plumbing issue, but the maintenance workers found nothing. Next came the cold. No matter how high we cranked the heat, the air always seemed icy, especially at night. One evening, as I was finishing up homework in my room, I heard it, a faint knock at my window. I froze, my pencil slipping from my fingers. We lived on the 5th floor. There was no balcony, no ledge. The knock came again, louder this time. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I slowly turned toward the window. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the city lights twinkling in the distance. But then, a shadow passed across the glass. I scrambled backward, my heart pounding. The shadow lingered, its shape distorted, like a figure pressed against the pane from the outside. And then it was gone. I didn't tell my parents. What could I say? They were already stressed from the move and the memories of what had happened, but I knew something was wrong, something was coming back. The next time it happened, I wasn't alone. My younger sister, Lily, came running into my room in the middle of the night, tears streaming down her face. "She's here," Lily whispered, clutching my arm. "Who?" I asked, even though I already knew. "The lady, the wet lady," Lily sobbed. "She was standing in my room." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You had a bad dream," I said, trying to calm her down, but my voice shook. She shook her head furiously. "No, I saw her. She was standing by my bed. She said she's not done with us." That night, I stayed up, sitting by Lily's bed, clutching a flashlight. Every sound in the apartment made me jump, the creak of the pipes, the rustle of the curtains. Around 3 a.m., I heard the hum, faint, almost imperceptible, like the one from the bog. I crept into the living room, my hands shaking. The hum grew louder as I neared the kitchen. There, on the counter, was the basket. The same basket. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. My mom would have thrown it away after we fled the house, but there it was, filled with those same shriveled apples, the same wilted flowers. The stench of decay filled the air so strong I gagged. A piece of paper lay tucked under the basket. Trembling, I unfolded it. Scrawled in jagged handwriting were 3 words, "I'm still waiting." The next day, I convinced my parents to let me stay with my aunt and uncle. I didn't tell them what I'd seen, they wouldn't have believed me. But I knew I needed answers. When I arrived at their new place much farther away from the bog, I finally told them everything. The knocks, the shadow at my window, the basket. My uncle's face went pale, and my aunt's hands trembled as she gripped her coffee mug. "We didn't want to scare you," my aunt said, her voice barely a whisper, "but this isn't the first time this has happened." "What do you mean?" I asked. My uncle sighed, running a hand through his hair. "That bog, it's cursed. There's an old story about it, passed down in this area. They say it's a place of sacrifices, where the people who lived here long ago offered gifts to something inhuman. If you take anything from the bog, berries, water, even a handful of dirt, it sees you. And it doesn't forget. But we didn't take anything," I said, my voice rising. "She gave me the basket." "That doesn't matter," my aunt said, her eyes wide with fear. "You accepted it. That's all it takes." We spent hours trying to figure out what to do. My uncle suggested returning to the bog, leaving the basket, and apologizing. But the thought of going back there made my stomach churn. I wanted to burn it, destroy it. But my aunt insisted that would only make things worse. "We have to give her what she wants," she said. "But what does she want?" I asked, though I was terrified of the answer. My uncle didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, his jaw tight. That night, I dreamed of the woman. She stood in the middle of the bog, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Her mouth opened, and the hum poured out, surrounding me, pulling me toward her. The water rose around my ankles, cold and slimy, and I couldn't move. Her hand reached out, skeletal and dripping, and as her fingers brushed my skin, I woke up gasping for air. We never figured out what she wanted. Not really. But we left the basket at the edge of the woods near the bog, along with an offering, a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, and a bundle of fresh flowers. My uncle said it was an old tradition, a way of appeasing whatever lurked there. For a while, things went quiet. The smells stopped. The cold faded. I started to believe it was over, but every year, around Thanksgiving, I still hear the hum. Faint and distant, like a memory I can't escape. And every year I wonder how long before she comes back, and what will she want next? I'll never forget that Thanksgiving at Grandma's house. It started out like any other family gathering, warm, loud, and full of delicious smells. Grandma lived in this creaky old house at the edge of the woods, the kind of place where the shadows seem alive when the sun goes down. I always thought it was charming. Until that night. Dinner was ready by sunset. The turkey looked perfect, golden and steaming, surrounded by mashed potatoes, stuffing, and cranberry sauce. Everyone was laughing, passing dishes around, and clinking glasses. It felt normal, safe. But as I looked out the window into the woods, something caught my eye. It was a shadow. No, it wasn't just a shadow, it moved. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the shape shifted closer to the house. It looked human, but it wasn't. Too tall, too thin. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Did anyone else see that?" My cousin Danny laughed. "See what? A turkey trying to escape dinner?" The family chuckled, but my stomach churned. I forced a smile and looked away from the window. Grandma's house always had strange creaks and groans, but that night, every sound felt wrong. During dinner, I heard faint tapping, tap, 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 coming from the window. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. No one else seemed to notice. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Grandma," I asked, "has anyone ever seen anything weird around here?" She paused, her wrinkled hand hovering over the gravy bowl. "Weird? Like what, dear?" "Like something in the woods," I said, my voice shaky. Her eyes darted to the window, then back to me. "Oh, just the wind, sweetheart, nothing to worry about," she said, smiling too wide. But her voice was tense, and she wouldn't look out the window again. As dinner went on, the noises grew louder, scratching at the walls, a low, hollow sound, like breathing, just outside. My little sister tugged my sleeve. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "I heard it," I whispered back, my pulse racing. Suddenly, the lights flickered, the laughter stopped. We all sat in silence, staring at each other. "Old wiring," Grandma said quickly, her voice shaking. "Nothing to worry about." But she wasn't convincing anyone. Then we heard it, a long, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the porch. My dad stood up. "Probably a raccoon," he said, trying to sound brave. He grabbed a flashlight and headed for the door. "Don't go out there," Grandma snapped, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard. Dad stopped, looking confused. "Why not?" Before she could answer, the door creaked open on its own. The cold air rushed in, and with it, the smell of something rotting. That's when we saw it. Standing just beyond the porch was the shadowy figure I'd seen earlier, only now it was clearer. Its limbs were too long, bending at unnatural angles, and its face. It didn't have one, just smooth, pale skin where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. We froze. No one moved. No one breathed. The thing tilted its head, as if studying us. Then it raised a hand, long, bony fingers, and pointed at the turkey on the table. "It wants the turkey," Danny whispered, his voice shaking. "No," Grandma said, her voice trembling. "It wants us." The thing let out a screech, high-pitched and deafening. The windows shattered, and the lights went out completely. Chaos erupted. Chairs toppled, dishes crashed, and someone screamed, "Maybe it was me." I grabbed my sister's hand and ran. We huddled in the pantry, listening to the sounds of destruction in the dining room. Heavy footsteps, the tearing of wood. And then, silence. When we finally worked up the courage to come out, the room was empty. The table was overturned, food scattered everywhere. But the worst part? Everyone was gone. Grandma, Danny, my parents, all of them. I don't know what happened that night, or what that thing was. My sister and I ran out of the house and didn't stop until we reached the nearest road. Every Thanksgiving since, I've stayed far away from Grandma's house. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that screech in my nightmares. And I know it's still out there, waiting. After that night, my sister and I didn't talk about what happened. Not to the police, not to our friends, not even to each other. When the authorities searched Grandma's house, they found no sign of anyone. No blood, no footprints, nothing. It was as if our family had vanished into thin air. The only thing they found was the turkey, still sitting on the floor of the dining room, cold, untouched. The police said it was a case of mass disappearance, though that explanation never made sense. Neighbors speculated. Some blamed a gas leak that caused hallucinations before everyone wandered off. Others whispered about strange cults and sacrifices. But I knew none of that was true. I knew what I saw. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure, its long, spindly arms, its featureless face, the way it tilted its head like it was curious. Or hungry. My sister, too, wasn't the same. She stopped talking altogether, staring out the window of our foster home like she expected someone, or something, to show up. Then, things got worse. It started small. I'd hear tapping at my window late at night, the same faint tap-tap-tap I'd heard at Grandma's. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew better. One night, I finally worked up the courage to look. What I saw chilled me to the bone. There was nothing there. But I could see footprints in the frost on the ground. They weren't human, too long, too narrow. They led from the woods up to my window. And then back again. I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe me? But my sister knew. She started sleeping in my room, curled up under the blankets, her small body trembling. She whispered one night, barely audible, "It's coming back." I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to tell her it was over, but I couldn't lie. On Thanksgiving the following year, we stayed home, just the two of us. We didn't cook. We didn't even talk. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. By evening, the sky turned an unnatural shade of gray, and the wind howled through the empty streets. I locked every door, every window, and turned off all the lights. "Maybe it won't find us," I whispered to my sister. She just shook her head. At exactly 7:13 p.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and my sister grabbed my hand. "It's here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The tapping started again, this time louder. Tap, tap, tap. But it wasn't just at the window. It was at the front door, the back door, the walls. It was everywhere, surrounding us. I tried to stay calm. We just have to stay quiet. It can't come in if we don't let it. Then the smell hit us. That same rotting stench from Grandma's house, thick and choking. My sister gagged, covering her nose. I pressed my back against the wall, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed earlier, though I knew it wouldn't help. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. For a moment, I thought maybe it had given up. Then I heard it, the soft creak of the floorboards, inside the house. I don't remember much after that, just flashes. The thing was in the hallway, its gangly form barely fitting through the doorway. It moved slowly, deliberately, like it was savoring the moment. My sister screamed, and I lunged at it with the knife, but it didn't even flinch. Its long fingers wrapped around my wrist, cold as death, and everything went black. I woke up hours later, alone. My sister was gone. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of the wind outside. I stumbled to the front door and opened it, half expecting to see her standing there, waiting for me. Instead, I saw footprints leading away from the house and into the woods. That was 2 years ago. I haven't seen my sister since, but I know she's still alive. I hear her voice sometimes, faint and distant, calling my name. I know she's out there, trapped. With it. Every Thanksgiving, I wait. I leave the lights off. I sit by the window with a knife in my hand, listening for the tapping. One day I'll go into the woods to find her, but not tonight, not yet. Every Thanksgiving, my family drives up to my aunt and uncle's place in rural Maine. It's one of those postcard-perfect settings, rolling hills, thick forests, and this massive cranberry bog that stretches out behind their house. They've lived there for decades, harvesting the berries and running a little shop selling pies and jams. I always thought the place was peaceful, until last year. We arrived the day before Thanksgiving. The sky was a dull gray, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth. My aunt greeted us with her usual warm smile, but something about her seemed off. Her eyes darted toward the window every few seconds, and her voice was quieter than usual. "Is everything okay?" I asked as she helped me unpack in the guest room. She hesitated, her hands lingering on a stack of folded towels. "The bog's been strange this year," she said finally. "Weird noises at night, animals going missing." She forced a laugh. "Probably just coyotes, but, well, it's got me spooked." That night, as we sat around the dinner table, I noticed my uncle was quiet too. He kept glancing at the back door, his jaw tight. When my dad asked him about it, he just shrugged and muttered something about the wind. I didn't think much of it at the time. After dinner, I went out onto the back porch to get some air. The bog stretched out before me, a dark, glossy expanse under the moonlight. It was beautiful in a haunting sort of way, the way the water reflected the tangled branches of the trees around it. Then I heard it, a faint, low hum, like a distant chorus of voices. I froze, straining to listen. It didn't sound like the wind or animals. It sounded human, but it was coming from the middle of the bog. I ran back inside, my heart pounding. When I told my aunt what I'd heard, her face went pale. She exchanged a quick glance with my uncle, but neither of them said anything. My mom laughed it off, saying I must have been imagining things. But I knew what I heard. The next day was Thanksgiving. The house was filled with the smell of roasting turkey, baked apples, and fresh cranberry sauce. Everyone seemed to be in good spirits, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. After lunch, my cousin suggested we go out to the bog to check it out. I hesitated, remembering the hum from the night before, but I didn't want to seem like a coward, so I grabbed my coat and followed. The bog looked different in the daylight, less eerie, more ordinary. My cousins, Sam and Emily, ran ahead, laughing and tossing rocks into the water. I hung back, scanning the area for anything unusual. Then I saw it, a shape just under the surface of the water. At first I thought it was a log, but it was too smooth, too pale. I stepped closer, squinting against the glare of the sun. The shape moved, just slightly, but enough to make my stomach twist. "Hey, do you see that?" I called to Sam and Emily. They came over, peering into the water. "See what?" Sam asked. "That," I said, pointing, but the shape was gone. The water rippled gently, as if something had just submerged. "You're imagining things," Emily said with a shrug, already turning back toward the shore. But I wasn't. I knew I wasn't. That night the hum came back, louder this time and closer. It woke me from a restless sleep, and I sat up, straining to hear. The sound wasn't just outside, it was inside my head, vibrating in my skull. It felt like it was pulling me, beckoning me toward the... I stumbled out of bed and made my way downstairs. The house was dark and silent, everyone else fast asleep. I slipped on my boots and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The hum grew louder as I approached the bog. The water glowed faintly under the moonlight, and I could see ripples spreading across its surface. My breath caught in my throat when I saw them. Figures rising from the water. They weren't human. Not anymore. Their skin was pale and slick, their eyes sunken and black. Their mouths hung open, and the hum poured out of them, blending into a haunting, otherworldly melody. They moved slowly, their bodies half submerged, their empty eyes fixed on me. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, frozen, as one of the figures reached out a long, bony arm, beckoning me closer. Its voice echoed in my head, not in words but in feelings, loneliness, hunger, despair. "Come with us," it seemed to say. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around to see my uncle, his face pale but determined. "Inside. Now," he hissed. He dragged me back to the house and slammed the door behind us. My aunt was waiting in the living room, her face tight with fear. "Did they see you?" she asked. "I don't think so," my uncle said. He turned to me. "You should have stayed inside." "What are they?" I demanded, my voice shaking. My uncle ran a hand through his hair. "The bog's old, older than this house, older than this town. Sometimes it takes people, and sometimes it gives them back, but they're not the same." The rest of the night was a blur. My uncle and aunt stayed up, keeping watch by the windows while I lay in bed, trembling. I could still hear the hum, faint but constant, as if it was calling to me. By morning, the bog was silent again, and the figures were gone. We packed up and left as soon as breakfast was over. My parents thought it was strange, but they didn't question it. My aunt and uncle hugged us tightly before we drove away, their faces lined with exhaustion. I haven't been back since. My parents think I'm being dramatic, but I know the truth. Something lives in that bog, something old and hungry, and it's still waiting.